Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Let's play a little word association game. When I say Oregon, what do you think of? Maybe tall, verdant forest next to the coast, or more recently, protests in Portland. And when I say the spotted owl, what do you think of? If you thought of timber wars, then you are definitely going to want to hear from our guest today, Aaron Scott from Oregon Public Broadcasting. Thanks for joining us today, Aaron.
Thank you very much for having me, Scott.
Aaron, you are, of course, the host of the Timber Wars podcast from OPB. It is a deeply reported 7-part series, so let's just start right from the ground level here. What were, or should I say are, the Timber Wars?
Yeah, so if you step back just a little bit to the 20th century, not that long ago, the plan here in the Pacific Northwest was that we were going to log through all of our old growth forests, and we were going to replant them with what were called kind of young, vigorous, thrifty trees. And we were going to turn our national forests into big tree farms that we would kind of log on a sustaining basis for years and years. And as anyone who grew up here or anyone who's flown over the Northwest knows, our landscape is covered in these clear cuts. And the timber wars really began in the 80s when some activists started to get concerned and then outraged about the fact that the forests around them were disappearing, and these kind of old growth forests that are often referred to as cathedral forests or sacred spots were getting cut down and replaced with these new young tree plantations. So activists started blockading logging roads and burying themselves in concrete and locking themselves around trees, and then very famously later on started sitting in trees for months or even years at a time, and kind of started this war in the woods that pitted loggers against environmentalists in this fight to either log our forests or to preserve some of them. And we should be clear, it's not a war between good and evil, and this is something we really focus on in the podcast, that it's really this struggle between two worldviews.
So people who grew up in the region have probably heard some form of the line, well, you can't cut down any trees whatsoever because of the spotted owl. And when you hear that, knowing this deeply reported series that you did, and obviously it's not true, I wonder how you sort of respond to that or educate people about it and say that, it really wasn't about the owl per se.
Yes, and the owl is definitely the poster child of the timber wars, and it's the hero or the villain, depending on who you're talking to. And to your question, for environmentalists, it was always a legal tool. You'll hear a lot of them say there's no Endangered Ecosystems Act, but there is an Endangered Species Act. So there's legal protections for animals that trees don't have. So for environmentalists, they use the owl as this leverage they could have in the courtroom to slow down logging, or in some cases stop it in certain forests. For the logging communities and the timber industry, it very much became this symbol of government overreach. And it felt like, the nation as a whole was valuing this motley little bird that nobody really knew anything about more than whole communities and more than human lives and livelihoods. And so we tell this story about how early on the environmentalists, or at least a lot of environmentalists, didn't want to pursue the owl. They were afraid that it would take the focus away from the forests and that it might backfire and it would alienate loggers, because in many ways, that's exactly what happened. It turned this fight into owls versus jobs. And it turned the Endangered Species Act and a lot of the other environmental laws, like the National Environmental Policy Act, that were passed almost unanimously under Republican presidents back in the 70s, it turned them into these partisan wedge issues that we're living with today that now divide us along lines of urban and rural and Democrat and Republican. And so in many ways, the owl was kind of this focus of attention that took away from the forests, and it was useful for environmentalists, but the point was always that they're fighting to save the forests. And so now, even as we see the owl, the spotted owl is really having a rough go as barred owls invade from the East Coast, to loggers that's saying, look, hey, we locked up the forests and what came of it? The owl's dying anyway. But to environmentalists, it's the feeling of, well, it's going to be sad if we lose the owl, but what ultimately they were trying to do was save the forests.
I grew up in this region in the 90s, and even I was surprised to learn a lot through your podcast about the involvement of the Clinton administration, specifically when Bill Clinton came into office in 1993. They really sort of tackled this issue head on, and compare that to the way George H.W. Bush, his predecessor, was sort of talking about the owl and the Endangered Species Act and logging before he lost re-election. And I wonder if, playing counterfactual is sometimes silly, but if you'll indulge me for a moment, let's say that Clinton did not win, that George H.W. Bush won a second term. And what do you think would have or could have happened? Would we have gotten the Northwest Forest Plan that Clinton brought us?
I mean, I think the short answer to that is no. Bill Clinton flew out his vice president and half of his cabinet here to Portland, Oregon, and he sat down a whole group of people, loggers, timber company owners, environmentalists, scientists, clergy, Native American leaders around this big table, and he talked to them for a day. And then he tasked his smartest scientists with coming up with this plan that would try to solve this big impasse that had been, these wars that have been raging for more than a decade at this point. And the Northwest Forest Plan, we should say, it kind of sought to manage the entire Northwest here in a way that protects enough old growth to preserve all the animals that depend on it, like the spotted owl and the marbled murrelet, but it still allowed enough timber harvest to keep timber towns and timber mills going and healthy. And Clinton, to his credit, kind of accepted this plan, even when it didn't deliver the amount of timber that he was hoping that it would. But to your question about would it have happened if Bush had won, and I think that's pretty clearly not. I mean, the Bush and the Reagan administration had both fought tooth and nail to keep timber harvests high. They ignored their own scientists. They pressured the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service not to list the owl as endangered or threatened. They basically repeatedly lost in court over and over again for ignoring environmental laws. And Bush himself campaigned on saying, owls are not more important than people. And if that's the way the laws are, we need to change the laws. So it's very possible that when the Endangered Species Act came up for renewal a couple years later, if Bush had won, Congress might not have renewed it, and we might not have an Endangered Species Act as we have it today. So yeah, the timber wars took a very different turn when the Clinton administration came into power. And this document we now live with, the Northwest Forest Plan, which, has failed in many regards and succeeded in others, but it very much defines the Northwest and the way we relate to our forests here. And it was very much something that came about because Clinton campaigned on this, and he delivered on his promise to try to find a solution really early on, right after he was elected.
It struck me that some of the protests of the 80s and 90s that we saw there in Oregon very much could have been plotted onto today and the protests that we see now. I wonder if you got a sense of what the environmental movement was doing back then, sort of carried through to today in the social and political climate that we're seeing now.
Yeah, and this was really interesting to me. We spend an episode kind of looking at this, and it traces somewhat back to the Northwest Forest Plan, because it was supposed to be this grand compromise. But before it really even had a chance to see if it would work, the Republican Senate overruled it with this thing called the salvage logging rider that basically said for a year, we could log anything and environmental laws wouldn't apply. There was no recourse. Environmentalists had to stop these logging sales other than putting their bodies on the line. And this kind of created this whole new generation of people out in the forests in the mid 90s that were more mainstream. There was, this great footage of a grandma with her neck locked to a logging truck in a documentary that we draw on. And there were politicians and lawyers out there getting arrested. And one of the activists we talked to, Tim Ream, talked about how, all these people came out to save trees, and before they knew it, they were getting pepper sprayed and chokeholds. And it radicalized a lot of people. And it really turned, especially Eugene, Oregon here, into this kind of hotbed of anti-capitalist and anti-globalization activism. So yeah, there's definite roots to a lot of the protest matters, especially here in the West and the Northwest, that trace back to the timber wars and these fights that were happening in the forest that then quickly went into government offices and senators and logging offices, and ultimately resulted in some big fire and arson events back in the 90s that were making national headlines too.
Speaking of fires, I know that you have been working on this project for well over a year before the big fires that we saw here in the Northwest in the month of September. However, I wonder if, one, any of the towns that you explored in this podcast were affected by those big Oregon fires, and two, whether afterward there was a sense from the timber industry or timber advocates saying, see, we've been telling you, if only we were allowed to log more, these fires wouldn't have happened.
Yes to both of those. I mean, the town that I spent a lot of time in and really focus on in this series is Mill City in the Santiam Valley, or Santiam Canyon, I'm sorry. And the fires swept through there. The town itself mostly escaped, but a lot of the neighboring communities and a lot of the people I interviewed it's a lot of houses burnt down. So they were deeply affected by these fires. And it was heartbreaking to watch, to know that many of the folks I talked to were losing their homes, or their family were losing their homes. And when I did check in on folks to make sure that they were okay, that was oftentimes one of the first things I heard is, these fires are because we're not managing the forests. And that's basically the evolution of the timber wars. I mean, it went from fighting to protect old growth forests to now this fight over what we should do with our forests to prevent wildfire, and in some ways to fight climate change. And that the argument for the timber industry is very much evolved from we need to log to kind of keep these economies healthy to now we need to log to protect these forests. And that feels right to a lot of the people who've grown up in those forests, because the fires weren't as big and as common as they are now. And yet, from a scientific standpoint, there's not a lot of grounds, especially here on the west side of Oregon. If you look at maps of where these fires burned, they burned as much and oftentimes hotter through clear cuts, through plantations and commercial forests, that managing the forest did not slow down, and in many ways it have made the forest more susceptible to fire. It's a different story kind of over where you all are on the east side in drier forests, where the forests are definitely overgrown from what they were historically, back when there used to be fires that would come through every couple of years, and really low intensity fires that would clean out the underbrush and clean out all the duff and the dead needles. And so over there, it is somewhere where there needs to be a lot more restoration work that involves cutting a lot of the small trees that are not commercially valuable, involves prescribed burning. And we kind of end the series there in this place in Central Oregon at a forest collaborative where environmentalists and loggers are trying to work together in a way that they can log enough to keep the local mill going, and yet at the same time make the forest more healthy and resilient to fire and climate change.
Well, it's good information and a great podcast. Aaron Scott from Oregon Public Broadcasting, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Scott.
Subscribe to Timber Wars wherever you get your podcasts, and for more science and environment reporting from Oregon Public Broadcasting, see their website at opb.org. And for more Northwest news, come to our website, NWPB.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.